There comes a moment in some people's lives when they stop trying to control everything, not because they are weak, but because they have finally realized that some things cannot be forced. Love is often one of those things. For Mwongeli, that moment came at 44 years old, and it began with a quiet prayer she had prayed at 42, one she never expected God to answer so precisely. Mwongeli had spent most of her adult life being practical. She was the kind of woman who made plans and followed them carefully. When she graduated from university in Nairobi in her early 20s, she had already mapped out the next 10 years of her life. Career, financial independence, travel. She achieved every one of those goals. By her mid-30s, she was working in international logistics and had built a stable, successful life for herself. But there was one area where plans had never worked the way she expected: relationships. In her early 30s, she had nearly married someone she believed would be her future. The relationship lasted 3 years. But in the end, it collapsed quietly under the weight of differences they had both ignored. After that, Mwongeli dated occasionally. Nothing serious. Nothing lasting. Over time, she noticed something among many of her friends. Some rushed into marriage out of fear of being alone. Others stayed in relationships that slowly drained their joy. And one evening, after listening to a friend cry through another painful breakup, Mwongeli sat alone in her apartment and thought deeply about her own life. She had always believed in God. Her faith had been part of her upbringing. But for the first time, she began thinking about what it meant to truly trust Him with her future, especially her love life. That night, she knelt beside her bed. "Lord," she said quietly, "I think I've been trying to manage everything myself." She smiled slightly and clearly. "That hasn't worked very well." She paused. Then she said something she had never said before. "If you have someone for me, I want you to arrange it. Not me, not pressure, not timelines. Just you." The prayer surprised even her. But when she finished, something inside her felt peaceful, as if she had just placed a heavy responsibility into better hands. 2 years later, Mwongeli's job offered her an opportunity she hadn't expected: relocation to Japan. Her company had expanded its operations in Asia, and they needed someone experienced to help oversee international partnerships. Tokyo. The idea felt both exciting and intimidating. She prayed about it for several weeks before accepting. If God truly was guiding her life now, she reasoned, then she would follow wherever the path led. Japan turned out to be both beautiful and challenging. The culture fascinated her. The quiet respect in everyday interactions, the efficiency of the trains, the subtle beauty of ordinary places. But starting over in a new country at 44 wasn't easy. For the first few months, work filled most of her time. Eventually, however, she began searching for community. That's when she discovered an international church in Tokyo. The congregation was diverse, people from many countries who had made Japan their temporary or permanent home. And slowly, the church became her anchor. She made friends, joined the Bible study group, even volunteered occasionally with community outreach programs. Her life felt full again. Yet she never forgot the prayer she had made years earlier: "Lord, arrange it." And because she had placed that prayer in God's hands, she rarely thought about it with urgency anymore. Until one afternoon changed everything. Hiroyuki was not the kind of man people easily forgot. At 48, he was one of the most respected corporate lawyers in Tokyo.com. Precise, intelligent. He had built his reputation over 20 years of disciplined work. But behind the polished professionalism was a quieter story. Hiroyuki had once been engaged. It had ended painfully when his fiancée decided she wanted a very different life from the one he envisioned. After that, he focused entirely on his career. Years passed, and though he occasionally considered dating again, nothing ever felt quite right. 3 years earlier, however, something in his life shifted. A colleague invited him to visit an international church. At first, he attended out of curiosity. But the messages about grace and purpose slowly began reshaping his perspective on life. Faith became part of his routine, not loudly, but sincerely. And occasionally, during quiet moments of prayer, he found himself asking God something simple. If marriage is still part of my future, guide me to the right person. He never expected the answer to arrive on a rainy afternoon. The rain had begun suddenly that day. Tokyo's streets shimmered beneath gray clouds as people hurried beneath umbrellas. Mwongeli had just left a small bookstore near the church when the downpour started. She stepped beneath a covered entrance to wait it out. A few minutes later, another person rushed under the same shelter. A man in a dark suit, slightly out of breath from the rain. He smiled politely. Looks like we both had the same idea. Mwongeli laughed softly. Yes, Tokyo weather has a sense of humor. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then the man glanced toward the church building across the street. Do you attend there? He asked. Mwongeli nodded. Yes. His eyebrows lifted slightly. So do I. They introduced themselves, Hiroyuki, Mwongeli. The rain continued falling, but neither of them seemed eager to leave the small shelter where they stood. The conversation began easily. They talked about Kenya and Japan, about the strange experience of finding community far from where you grew up, about how they had both unexpectedly discovered faith later in life. I spent a long time believing I was too rational for faith, Hiroyuki admitted. What changed? Mwongeli asked. He considered the question carefully. I realized that rationality had built my career, he said, but it hadn't built my life. Mwongeli was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. I think I understand that more than you know. Then Hiroyuki said something that made Mwongeli smile in surprise. A few years ago, he admitted, I asked God to guide me to the right person. Mwongeli laughed gently. I asked him to arrange my marriage. Hiroyuki looked at her thoughtfully. Perhaps, he said slowly. He enjoys answering prayers creatively. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and neither did the conversation. Hiroyuki told her about his work, the long years of building a reputation case by careful case. The way corporate law demanded a particular kind of patience he had eventually learned to carry into the rest of his life. Mwongeli told him about logistics, about the way international supply chains were essentially enormous puzzles that required both precision and adaptability, and how she had discovered that she was very good at holding both things at once. Hiroyuki listened with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. She noticed that immediately. It was the kind of listening that made a person feel like what they were saying actually mattered. By the time the rain had eased to a light drizzle, neither of them had moved from the shelter. Not because the weather kept them there, but because something about the conversation felt worth continuing. When Hiroyuki finally said he needed to get back to his office, he hesitated at the edge of the shelter. Would you like to continue this conversation sometime? He asked, over coffee, when the weather is less dramatic. Mwongeli laughed. I think Tokyo owes us that much, she said. They exchanged numbers. Hiroyuki stepped out into the drizzle and walked away. Mwongeli stood for a moment longer beneath the shelter, looking out at the rain-soaked street, thinking about the prayer she had prayed years earlier in a Nairobi apartment. Lord, arrange it. She hadn't thought about that prayer in months, but standing there in a doorway in Tokyo, with the rain falling and a strange warmth still settling in her chest, she thought about it now, and smiled. The rain eventually stopped, but the conversation did not. The 2 years between the rain shelter and the Kyoto garden were 2 of the fullest years of Mwongeli's life. Coffee became a ritual, then Sunday church together, then long evening walks through Tokyo neighborhoods that she had once navigated alone and now explored with someone beside her. Hiroyuki was not a man who rushed anything, which suited Mwongeli perfectly. because she had spent years learning that the things built carefully last longer than the things built quickly. He met her friends from the international church. She met his colleagues, careful, measured people who reflected something of what he was. They prayed together before difficult decisions. They disagreed sometimes, honestly, without drama, and found that disagreement, handled well, only deepened the trust between them. And through all of it, Mwongeli occasionally thought about the prayer, the one she had prayed in Nairobi, the one that had felt almost reckless in its simplicity. Lord, arrange it. Not because she had been passive, she had shown up, moved to Japan, stepped beneath a rain shelter at exactly the right moment. But the arranging, the precise, patient, unmistakably intentional arranging, that had been his. The Kyoto garden was quiet on the evening Hiroyuki proposed. Cherry blossoms drifted through the air. He knelt with the same calm certainty he brought to everything. And Mwongeli said yes through tears that surprised her. Not because she hadn't expected it, but because in that moment the full weight of the prayer and its answer arrived all at once. They married on a Saturday in early spring, a small ceremony at the International Church where they had first discovered they attended the same congregation. The same walls where she had found her anchor when Tokyo felt too vast and too foreign. Now those walls held something else entirely. Her mother flew in from Nairobi. She sat in the front row in a bright green dress and cried from the moment Mwongeli walked in until long after the vows were finished. Afterward, when Mwongeli hugged her, her mother whispered something into her ear. I prayed for this man before I knew his name. Mwongeli pulled back and looked at her. Her mother simply smiled. Mothers pray these things, she said. We just don't always tell you. Life after the wedding was not a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was ordinary in the most beautiful way. Saturday mornings when Hiroyuki made coffee and Mwongeli sat at the kitchen table with her Bible, and they didn't speak much, but the silence was warm and full. The adjustments that came with two people from very different worlds choosing to build one shared world together, learning which disagreements needed conversation and which ones simply needed time, the way he remembered small things, the way she took her tea, the authors she loved, the particular tiredness that settled on her face after a difficult work week, and the way that remembering felt, to Mwongeli, like being truly known. She called home often. Her mother always picked up on the first ring. And there was a particular joy in being able to say, honestly and without performance, that she was happy. Not a happiness that depended on everything going right, but the deeper kind. The kind that holds even when things are hard, because it is rooted in something that cannot be moved. Mwongeli thought about the prayer sometimes. The one prayed in a Nairobi apartment at 42 years old, kneeling beside her bed, placing something she had carried too long into better hands. Lord, arrange it. She had not known then what the arranging would look like. She could not have imagined Tokyo, or a rain shower on an ordinary afternoon, or a man in a dark suit with the kind of patience that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, that she did not need to rush. But God had known. He had been arranging long before she asked. That was perhaps the thing that moved her most, even years later. Not just that he had answered, but that he had already been working before the prayer left her lips. Not quickly, not dramatically, but perfectly. One quiet step at a time. She was not the only one. In this same universe, Ida had once dreamed of a face he didn't yet know, and found her at a festival in Kyoto. Tokaru had prayed for 5 years in faithful silence, and found Muna on a park bench with a Bible in her lap. Kavuli and Masahiro had whispered the same prayer on the same night across the same city, and found each other the very next afternoon. Each story different. Each answer perfectly timed. Each one written by the same hand. And even now, in the same city where Mwongeli and Hiroyuki had found each other, another story was quietly beginning. A woman visiting Tokyo for the first time, a man who had grown up in a church his father helped build, a visiting pastor, a quiet prayer meeting, and a sentence spoken into the air that would take years to fully understand. Because in God Wrote This Love Story, the stories never stop. They only keep beginning. She knelt beside her bed in Nairobi, not dramatically, not loudly, just honestly. Lord, if you have someone for me, I want you to arrange it. Not her, not pressure, not timelines, just him. And then she packed her bags, relocated to Tokyo, found a church, stepped under a rain shelter. And God arranged it exactly as he promised, in his own time, in his own way, more precisely than she ever could have planned herself. That is the God Wrote This Love Story universe. A world where surrender is not weakness. It is the beginning of everything. Watch Story 5, The Marriage That Started with a Prophecy next, and subscribe to Written by Grace because the universe is still unfolding.